Hello, I'm James Butler, and we're here today to talk about the changing nature of cybersecurity and how we can drive more value from cyber. I normally work with customers around digital transformation, strategy, and shaping and overseeing those transformations. And for me, as someone who sits slightly on the edge of cyber, I normally defer to my learned colleagues on cyber and would bring them in as soon as there's a cyber problem to solve. But actually, cyber is not something we can treat as a separate problem anymore. And increasingly over time, we found that digital conversations and data conversations are also cyber conversations. So it's really interesting in today's world to reflect on the changing nature of how these topics collide and come together, and how we all need to see cybersecurity differently. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So should we do some introductions? Ben, do you want to start?
Hi there, I'm Ben Hampshire. I'm a partner at FSP and I look after our security leadership and transformation capabilities, looking after our fractional security leadership, board advisory and cyber team as a service offerings.
Yeah, hi there, I'm Matt Austen. I'm a principal security consultant working within the security architecture capability group.
My name's Dave Pearcy. I work as lead consultant for GRC, that's governance, risk and compliance capability.
So Ben, when we're talking about cybersecurity, I sort of try and think back to 20 years ago, and I think about network engineers, and that was just before cloud was kicking in, just when we were still understanding what it meant to do remote working and really take advantage of the internet. Cybersecurity, it was people who are deeply technical, in darkened rooms, worrying about firewall configuration. But things have changed massively now, and the security conversation now, we'd be talking about AI, we'd be talking about nation-state actors. Just take us through a bit what's driven the sort of shift in cybersecurity and maybe the CISO perspective on the last sort of 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at the history of the CISO role, it's probably a good way to frame it. So the first CISO, I believe it was Citigroup, was the company, and that was 1995. So in kind of the grand scheme of things, it's still very new. If you compare it to a CFO role started in the early 1900s and were kind of fully defined with a career path and everything by the 1960s and 70s. So this is very, very new still. If you kind of roll forward from 95 through into kind of the early 2000s, it was very much a compliance-focused role, security. So it was financial services, other highly regulated industries, nuclear, other types of energy, those sorts of roles, but it's very much around security compliance. If you kind of then roll on into the kind of the next phase, we then got into more of a risk-focused role, which was starting to understand what security meant for businesses and the risks that came from it. We'd had a few higher profile attacks happen in that time. They were starting to hit the news as well, so it's becoming more of a thing. Then if you get into the next phase, which is kind of 2009, really kind of through to 2019, almost kind of that golden age of cybersecurity when it really became a thing and everyone started talking about it. We had the big attacks like TalkTalk. We had the Edward Snowden leaks that everyone thought was cool, and there was films made about it. And the CISO at that point got into more of a threat-based role, and it was really starting to understand threat actors, come back to nation states, organised crime. I think in that period as well, organised crime realised they could make money from this. And then we got into the privacy shift as well at the back end of that, which is where we had the big data leaks coming back to TalkTalk. Equifax was another big one that happened in that period. WannaCry, NotPetya, all these kind of high-profile attacks that happened. It was changing the profile of the CISO because obviously businesses were getting more worried. And then we hit 2020 and the pandemic happened and everybody went into massive digital transformation projects. And then the CISO role changed again because now it was all of this technology suddenly arrived and we've got to secure it all. So that's kind of the history of it and where it's kind of come from. And these aren't changes necessarily in what the CISO is doing. It's bolt-ons all the time. So they've had to kind of, if they could, continue that. and take in all those aspects before, apply them to the new aspects that are coming in. We've got AI now, which is going to be the next phase. And also we're looking more now with CISOs being business enablers, which is something we're going to get into as we talk.
Yeah.
But that's the history of it.
Yeah. It's such a big step change. You've gone from a sort of technical expert to a threat and risk leader, bolstering the business's transformation efforts to now someone who needs to understand how to enable the organisation to move faster and drive more value.
Yeah.
Dave, from a governance point of view, I assume there's been the same sort of shift. Do you want to just maybe reflect on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you know, Ben's gone through the history of how things have manoeuvred on. I mean, one of the things that's really important, one of the things that I always think about when you think about security leadership, is the first thing that you should be doing when you go into an organisation is identifying risks, security risks. So you've got, you know, the first thing you do is a gap analysis. And then once you've gone through that, you actually need a way to manage those risks. So managing the risks becomes important. So actually one of the number one items that a CISO should be thinking about these days is, have I got a functioning risk framework? And, you know, it's almost like they're all part of the whole information security element, if you like. If you look at all the sort of standards, they all very much rely heavily on risk management and making sure that you are managing risks. And that's one of the reasons why you are enabling the business, because you are opening up and giving vision to all the things that could go wrong within you, with that cybersecurity, data protection, identity, all the various different bits. And that's what's important now. And I think that's changed from, you know, the past where it was very much about, have we got the door shut? You know what I mean? How are we managing the networks and things like that? Yeah.
In digital transformation, we often talk about making the shift from the IT department of no to an enabling department that can be there driving faster business change. And I suppose that's what underpins a lot of that shift in how we do governance, is that if you understand the risks properly, you can actually move more quickly. Is that fair?
Absolutely. You know, it is a mind shift that's happened within the information security network, and you know, and things like that. You go into conversations thinking about how can we make this work, not how can we stop this from happening. You know, instead of saying when a project comes along and they want to, I don't know, go off in a direction that might be a bit, I'm not sure about that. There's certain data protection elements that we need to consider. There's certain technical elements that we need to consider. The view is not to say, well, no, we can't do that, but, you know, start at a position of high security and maneuver your way down to a position where you've got the security, but you've also got the user ability to do what they need to do within the organisation, or to sell, or to, you know, create profit, what a business needs to do.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting with some of that as well is that you can't do that governance separately from understanding the business. This isn't something you can sort of do in a back room anymore, looking at have you got the right technical controls on your SSL version that your web servers are supporting or something. That's such a tiny fraction of it now. You've got to be looking at what are the risks in context of your business strategy and business products and processes. Matt, from a sort of security delivery point of view, in terms of how you actually do the work in security, I know one of the things we've discussed is how, rather than security programs being typically something separate, again, they should be linked into and embedded in the way you do your technical delivery of your change, of your digital transformation and so forth. And one of the interesting things is the changing role of cyber professionals. It's not just the CISO and the governance team who are affected. I remember us talking about the TalkTalk example of how suddenly deeply technical cyber experts are being put in the public domain. I don't know if everyone will know that example. So is that an interesting one to talk about?
Yeah, I think so. I think if we just took the example of the sort of shifting perimeter, we talked earlier about the years ago the security was seen as the guys in the network teams doing the firewall policies and reviews. now that perimeter has shifted from the network perimeter and hardcore to a softer middle as such, and people can build services and applications within that walled garden as such without having to worry too much about the security impacts because of the wider perimeter protections. Now that shifted to the identity, that the perimeter's moved to the identity, every application and service, there is there's much more security considerations at play and that need to be factored in. So ensuring that those security concerns and risks and requirements are understood by all people within those roles is critical, and rather than having that sort of centralized function that provides a level of oversight.
I think, when you talked about, you mentioned the Talk incident, and I think it was Dido Harding who was put in front of the cameras.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it opened the eyes to a lot of board members that actually you need someone who knows what they're doing to be talking, because she was thrown under a bus, really. She wasn't informed in that conversation. Yeah. And, that's exactly what, you're saying. It's not just that element. It's, everyone needs to know what's going on.
Yeah.
Something like that. And especially the board and, people involved there.
Yeah, I mean, we're dealing with an incident, especially of a high profile nature like the one we're just discussing here. It's not just about the security professionals. It's about PR, marketing, legal.
Yeah.
All of those, all of those people need to be coming on board to ensure it's managed and dealt with in an appropriate fashion.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we need to do this up front in the life cycle. If you leave it till the end to understand what you're doing, you're not going to be compliant from a regulatory point of view, because everybody has at least privacy as a regulatory concern. Yeah. You've got to think about that up front. But also, you're not really understanding the risks until too late, and trying to deal with stuff when they actually come to fruition and you've got an incident to manage. If you haven't already prepared for that and you don't understand your business impacts, then you're going to end up with some poor cyber person who's responsible for incident management trying to explain it all in public, and that's going to be painful for everybody. I think if we just sort of step back and look at the conversation we've had, I see lots of parallels with the cyber world with what we typically talk about to customers around data. Traditionally, data was seen as something that happens in IT. It's a storage problem. It's a low-level technical thing. But actually now, data is one of the key drivers of business value. And if the business aren't understanding that, don't have a strategy to get the value out of it, and aren't thinking about their responsibilities and ownership, then IT can't deliver any value. And it sounds like cyber's very much in the same place now. Often with that sort of shift, you need to start with leadership right at the top. How do we help senior people in organizations understand the value of taking action around cyber? How can CISOs work with their senior executive peers and boards to try and build that awareness about what's needed from a top-down perspective?
Yeah, so this is the current kind of state with this is we've got the carrot and we've got the stick. I think in Europe we've got the carrot, which is that everyone knows that board level should understand cyber and should be able to challenge and work with the CISO. If you go over the Atlantic to the US, they've actually started legislating around this now with the Security Exchange Commission ruling that came in a few years ago, which is actually starting to mandate now that board level, they have to have suitably qualified board members that know about cyber. It's very likely that's going to come over at some point because it makes sense. It's got to be at that level. When we do our board advisory work and we speak to boards about cyber and what their responsibilities are, we always say to them that they need to own the why when it comes to cyber. They need to know why their company would be attacked, why attackers would get value from attacking them. That's the return on infection from the attacker's perspective. And then they need to understand what it means for the business as well. So the so what in cyber. Cyber has this. We always talk about stuff and we go into a lot of meetings and there's a bit of a so what attitude. Why do we need to do this? The boards need to own that bit. And it's really important then for the CISO, because the CISO can then get the correct level of support and challenge from the board. Quite often CISOs are in a bit of a bubble on their own, which is not a good place to be. And they can be going off doing their own thing. It's not necessarily aligned with the business. It's not necessarily aligned with objectives, finances, all those strategic elements. And then they get very short tenures as well, which is what we see. So they tend to come in, they've got their idea about what they want to do, they do that, they don't really align with the business, they don't get involved at the board level, they don't necessarily get involved at the C level sometimes as well, and then we see them move on very quickly. And that leaves these transformational projects that have started and not completed often, and then another CISO may come in and start another one, and it's just not very cost effective. So we're coming back to value for businesses. That's not a very good way to realise value on your investment into cyber.
It's really interesting. I wonder if everyone's putting too much of this problem on cyber professionals and on CISOs. Yeah. How can boards be a good partner to a CISO? Like, what should they be looking for? How can they try and be supportive in terms of helping their cyber leadership and cyber function create more value and be better value? Yeah,
it still comes back to the board understanding the threats. If they understand that, they can provide the right level of challenge. And I think that's the key thing now around this CISO board level relationship is the challenge that the board can give to the CISO. They can't let them run away and do their own thing. Yeah. They've got to make sure that any cyber strategy is fully aligned with everything else the business is doing. Got to understand the impact that would come from any cyber attack, so they can prepare for it accordingly. But it's building that relationship with them. They'll have the same level of relationship with the CEO, with the CFO, CTOs potentially. I think because the CISO is still a relatively new role, it's still maturing in that sense. And CISOs can be sat in different positions as well. We've seen that in companies. Sometimes they're under CTO, sometimes they're, they can be in lots of different places. So it's almost back to that historical element. If you look at the CFO and the path they've got these very recognised career paths now. They're very established in where they sit in a company and their relationship with the board and what the board needs to do in order to challenge and enable the CFO. CISOs aren't quite in that space yet. So this is why we see this gap. And like I said, it's been legislated for in the US. So there's no choice. They've got to do it. And that has led to, there's three real ways to try and fix that as a board. One is either you happen to have someone on the board who understands cyber. That's probably quite rare. The second option is you bring in someone onto the board that has a cyber experience, or you can go down the route of the board being trained and advised on cyber through an independent party. Those are three real recognised routes.
I think it's interesting what you said about, the CISO coming under different elements of the business. I mean, that I've seen that for various full teams, full information security teams. Over the years, I've worked for various different teams, and they've either been, they could be under compliance, they could be under finance. There's never a comfortable place for them. And I think that's because they have to have their finger in every pie within an organisation. Yeah. And that's same for the team, because different elements of the team will do different bits. Some will work on IT, some will work in compliance, but even more for the guy who's sat at the top, who's managing that team, the CISO.
Yeah. When you look at it from a risk perspective, it's exactly on that juncture between technology and business, isn't it? And you have to really try and integrate these two perspectives, which is very digital, isn't it? It's like, how do you go from separate worlds into one integrated framework of making all this stuff hang together? I mean, Dave, from a governance and risk perspective, obviously most mature organisations are pretty good at enterprise risk, and they have a pretty well-established structure of looking at risk up into the board from a sort of traditional business perspective. So I guess part of the equivalent governance journey to the role of the CISO is how cyber governance and cyber risk has been integrated into enterprise risk and business risk management.
Yeah, well, I mean, it all should fit together. You should have a risk environment that covers everything, and you'll often go and work for an organisation, and they might have enterprise risk being managed, but nothing else. Or you tend to have disparate teams with their own risk logs knocking around. So, you know what I mean? The information security team, because they want to go for, standard or something like that, will have a risk log over here. Project teams have risk logs on their agendas, which will contain information security risks. And then there's the enterprise risk, organizational risks, functional risks that each department have. But they'll find that no one's talking to each other, and the same risk might be documented in a number of different places. And again, that's why it almost has to feed up to one place, and your CISO has to be above that. Your CISO has to understand not just the information security risks, but the information security risks against the organisational risks.
Yeah. If you can't, if you don't understand the business impacts and how these things will manifest in practice, you can't really put a value against them, can you? And then you don't know how to prioritise.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, if you think about what you basically said about the CISO or the CISO team being the juncture between the business and IT from a risk perspective. From my experience, I see a lot of issues where the CISO or the CISO team are misaligned with the business objectives and are not then supportive of the big technology transformation programs and become key blockers. So if that's critical, it's making sure that they are aligned to ensure that they can provide that important function. Yeah.
So let's come back to that point. One thing that was occurring to me while we were talking about risk and business impacts and so forth is, how do you actually protect yourself against that risk? So, in a traditional risk environment, you either you reserve against the risk, you insure the risk, or you take action to remove it, essentially, and you control it properly. So, but cyber insurance, I find that a really interesting space, because that's changed a lot, hasn't it? I mean, is that just drill into how cyber insurance has changed?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you go back 10 years, 10, 15 years, your cyber insurance were an add-on to your organisational insurance. You'd probably fill in 4 fields, about, whether you can have cyber insurance or not. And that's how it was considered. But as insurers have understood the impact of, an incident and what can happen, and we've talked about certain things that had happened over the time period, then they've started to realise that, one, they can't do that. They need to work with an organisation to understand what their risk posture, their security posture, their risk posture is around that. And you have long forms asking about your networks, about your awareness of your staff, and all these various different questions now, almost to the point where you'd be better off following an ISO framework to get your insurance or something like that. They'll pen test you. They'll do everything to make sure that you're a good bet, when it comes down to insuring you. And on top of that, they'll also want to be involved if something happens. So if there's a security incident, your insurance wants to know about it, and they want to supply their own people to help you fix that, because then they've got the assurance from their people that it's happening. So it's changed massively. And also, with any insurance, it's full of catches and small print and things that you really need to be on top of, because, you might find when you sat there in the middle of a data incident, we're not insured for it.
So how should organisations see cyber insurance in context of managing their risk? I mean, clearly it doesn't solve all the problems. If you've got cyber insurance, how much does that actually help? Or is it more the process of getting better at doing your cyber insurance helps inform your understanding of where you need to take action? Bit of both?
Well, I mean, it works alongside, your information security posture and your teams and all the things that you put in place to manage the risk. It works alongside that. It'll cover some of what you need to do, but it won't cover everything. For example, when it comes to data protection risks, when I've worked in the finance industry, you might have the risk of people wanting to claim compensation, and it'll cover that. You know what I mean? But it won't cover reputational. It won't cover other elements that you need to be able to be aware of. So it has a place, but not necessarily the main focus. You've got to use it a lot in line with everything else that you need to do to have a good security posture.
Yeah, I guess going back to what you were saying, Ben, at board level, that sort of is the cyber insurance is one way you can sort of start to take action against your threat model and start to reduce the risk, and it covers part of the solution. But how do we, I guess there's that link back into what you were talking about around return on infection and people understanding the value of taking action, trying to put a return on that action.
Yeah.
try and quantify that in a way that makes sense to boards and to enable them to justify investment.
Yeah, I mean, cyber return on investment is kind of one of those dark areas in cyber, which sometimes people avoid because they say it can't be done because of the nature of attacks. I always challenge that back and say, well, let's look beyond cyber to begin with, and let's just look at the existential risks to your company. If you're a manufacturing company, I don't know, you're making widgets. If you can't make widgets for 2 weeks, what happens? It's that sort of level. And I think often they trip up a little bit with cyber and think it's just about ransomware, it's just about data leakage. It's actually not. There's a lot more to it in terms of kind of fraud, denial of service, these different types of attacks. So we always start there. What can your company not afford to lose?
And do you see companies being valued more on their approach to cybersecurity?
They are, yeah. So if you take, so we do a lot of work with private equity. And so if you look at private equity companies' portfolio, they go through 4 different stages. They go through the due diligence stage, where if you have good cyber capabilities, your value will be increased because of that. We definitely know it decreases if you don't have that. Then you've got the onboarding phase, which is maybe onboarding into other companies if you've been acquired that way. That is really kind of an intense period for any company who's ever been through it. And then we're into kind of, identities being matched to get into the architecture side of it. And, the risk profile then completely changes because you've merged these 2 companies. So that's the stage that has to be gone through that private equity cycle. And then you're into the actual kind of development of capabilities and how cyber can increase value before exit. Which is really key again, because when companies are then being valued at the exit stage, good cyber is really important in that. What you definitely don't want with a company you've just acquired is that they receive a huge attack and you've got a multi-million-pound bill to fix it all. And that can either be a direct cost, which is that, they've had an attack. You've got to pay ransom demands if that's the way you're going to go. Your insurance premiums may go up. You're going to have to bring in outside help. You're going to have to buy new equipment. Kind of direct short-term injections of cash that you weren't expecting, which kind of devalues the company potentially over that time. You've then got longer term, if you have to go through transformational projects to get cyber to where it needs to be, that's got to be considered. So having that done beforehand or have a handle on it, that will increase the value. Then there's the indirect element to this as well, which is where you look at threats like IP theft is a really big one. We've seen this happen over probably the last 5 or 6 years or so, where usually nation-state sponsored actors are getting in and stealing IP of companies, and then they will take those blueprints, those ideas, and they'll take them to another country where it can be manufactured or kind of procured, or the service can be delivered for a much lower price, and it starts to undermine other markets. So a lot of companies aren't aware of the risk around that. And again, this comes back to really understanding your existential risk as a business, which is much beyond cyber. It's about, like I said, if a competitor comes in and undercuts you, how much of a risk is that to you? Oh, it's existential, right? Well, let's show you now the cyber route to making that happen. Again, the return on infection for the attacker. So then they can start to build out strategies and spend money in the right areas.
Makes sense. I guess a lot of what we've talked about so far is understanding the threat, understanding the risk, how you can try and control and reduce that risk. But what really matters is how you take action. We talked a bit earlier around the changing nature of cyber delivery and needing to get much better aligned with the business through that process. Matt, do you want to just talk to us a bit around what that looks like in practice? Is this where DevSecOps comes in? Is that what helps solve some of these problems at a delivery level?
Yeah, I think it's security ensuring that teams, that the business from a cyber perspective can move quickly and with as less friction as possible. And I think the idea of DevSecOps and DevOps, the shift left, allows and empowers teams to work within a set framework, set of requirements with guardrails, without that constant need for the presentation of barriers at particular junctures within a SDLC process, for example. But if we take developers, for example, if they can have tooling that gets them instant results to the quality of their code they're developing on each keystroke, and they can then make amendments on that direct immediate feedback, that's far more valuable than getting all the way through to test UAT type phases, then realizing the mistake when there's a security review, and then having to go back to the development phase to remediate.
You're talking about, security being part of that speed to market. That's what you're talking about there, isn't it? Rather than the gateways that you have to push things through.
Yeah, I think it's moving away from that siloed security function that sits there and sort of marks people's homework as a sort of the last stage before the release to baking it into the teams that are developing and enabling the business. So that could be the implementation of security champions, as I said earlier, being clear on requirements and guardrails that the teams and the organisation needs to comply with, so that everyone has a bit of the skin in the game there. And ultimately, it's the education for those teams and individuals to understand, so they are aware of their responsibility from a cyber perspective. So it doesn't then just come back down to, well, I don't know cyber because I'm the software developer. That's the guy over there's concern.
I guess, the CISO's such an integral part to that in terms of security leadership, that if they don't have clear direction on what needs to be achieved, don't have a clear set of goals, don't then understand the capabilities that are in the teams underneath them, that can cause real friction, can't it, between what the CISO is asking you to do and then what the team's actually capable of delivering through whatever reason.
Really, from top to bottom, what we've got there is we need to pull the security work towards the business and up front rather than when something goes wrong. And security can only do that if they're an enabler for the whole of the rest of the business. So it changes the role of all of the security professionals. And I suppose I found that really interesting. If you think about DevOps in terms of its origins being all about how do you deliver work faster, sort of using lean principles to re-engineer the way you do your delivery, change the interface between different delivery teams to make that much slicker. Cyber is an integral part of that, and your role is almost to make all of the people in that process play their part in security. So you mentioned developers writing better code. We're also going to have infrastructure engineers writing better scripting on the infrastructure, and so secure by design and sort of equivalent to privacy by design and those sorts of regulatory driven approaches is not just checking earlier and saying no to stuff earlier. It's actually how do you empower people, all of the stakeholders, to get it right first time. Is that a fair way to describe it?
I think it is, but I think it all comes down to, which is quite common in my experience, is the conflict in objectives between the security and the
that's a great point.
And the technology functions more generally, or the business. And so you'll find that if let's talking about a sort of technology transformation program, you'll have the core program that's delivering the change. Very much their objectives are delivering for the business, the increasing collaboration or whatever it might be. But the security's objectives will tend to be keeping the lights on, making sure we don't increase security risk and the like. And there is a mismatch there because teams want to work in a more collaborative fashion. They want to be able to work with external parties collaboratively rather than with lots of barriers in the way. If security aren't on board with that set of objectives and the approach, there's going to be constant conflict throughout that program and delivery.
And does that change depending on what market you're in as well? So, for example, if you're in retail and you want to get things out fast and quicker so that you're keeping up with competitors against perhaps, Ministry of Defence or banking teams, retail, or, banking environments where, there's a lot of regulatory boxes to tick as well.
In my experience with organisations with heavy regulatory oversight, I think there is more conflict and differing objectives between security and business technology functions than there is in other other organisations. Yes.
Yeah.
And that is. Do you think that's because? Let me turn that around. Actually, what do you think is the root cause of that? And is that because the cybersecurity function needs to prevent change in order to reduce risk, or is this something different around alignment? Like what's behind all of that?
I think a lot of it is to do with reducing change to prevent the increase in risk, because that meets we can tick the box for meeting regulatory requirement X that way. Whereas actually what they need to be done is they need to be challenged on we need to do this, i.e. we need to increase collaborative, working between us and another organisation. And to do that, that shifts how we now need to comply with that regulatory framework or environment.
The thing for me is that mindset of preventing change is reducing risk. If you're on a board, that feels wrong to me, because if I look at all of these, so we mentioned defence and we mentioned financial services, right? Both disrupted by AI. They're going to be disrupted by quantum. They're going to be disrupted by all the sort of macroeconomic global stuff that's going on. They need to be able to respond faster, not slower. And the biggest risks are the kind of the existential ones, not the detailed risks of IT configuration management. So
maybe it's an investment problem. If security teams aren't properly don't have the investment, i.e. they're not growing in numbers to support both the keeping the lights on and ensuring the organisation is secure, plus supporting the lakes of AI and quantum, I think the conflict is always going to be, right, we need to maintain the baseline, the status quo of security. So you need to properly resource the programs that are going to deliver for the business in that sense.
I think we've I mean, one of the key themes that we've talked about, or certainly started talking about at the beginning, is how things change over time in history. And that's not going to change. Is that things change, if that makes sense. But that's not going to change, because as we've said, well, if you just look back at how things changed when we all started jumping into the cloud, you know what I mean? That was an area where, and one of my phrases is, the principles never change. The principles about what we're doing never change. We still need to protect data. We still need to do all those things. But the approach and how we do it has changed. And that happened in cloud, and that's starting to happen in AI, and it will happen in quantum. And I think that's about, the role, the leadership role needs to be a role that is changeable, that changes with the times, with the technology, with whatever's
but it's not just the leadership level. I mean, we were talking at sort of delivery level. I think it's really hard for cyber teams nowadays, because we said this earlier, you still got to do all the same old stuff, firewalls and all the rest of it. But then if you're operating in the cloud, which everybody is now, you need a different skill set. And actually, that we haven't touched on that. What we often talk about cloud native, zero trust architectures. What does that do to the sort of cyber delivery and transformation challenge? Is that totally different? Is it the same old principles? But what effect does that sort of changing security architecture have on some of this?
I think it makes it makes it more complex, because I think we mentioned earlier the idea of this sort of network perimeter, the walled garden, and not having to worry too much about the security inside. Now you've got to worry, the perimeter is effectively everywhere. And so ensuring that everything is hardened and suitable for internet exposure as such is important. And so that idea of assume breach, don't trust system X because it's sitting on the same network, ensure there's process and validation in place to validate or each request and call is critical, and is a massive mind shift for not just technology teams in general, but for security. And I think the problem that I see is that security teams get left behind to some degree. So the new ways of working and the technologies are sort of the forefront of the minds of the teams that are delivering it. Security get nervous by them because they don't have the same experience with them.
Well, one of the things we've heard a lot in recent years is that if you're not assuming breach, you're not doing things right in a cyber world. I was just thinking while we were talking, as well as assume breach, we should also be assume change. We can't base any aspect of cyber or digital nowadays on reducing risk through preventing change. And that's such a big mindset shift for all of us. Sorry, Ben, what were you going to say?
So I think a lot of this, again, comes back to maybe board level and more senior C-suite level, not having understanding of what cyber means to a change. So let's maybe think about cloud again. So when all that happened, companies, boards saw the shift to cloud and went, actually, that's really great. We don't have to pay for all this tin anymore. We can make cost savings, and it's more efficient. People can access it easier.
And reduce risk by not having to do all the patching in-house, all that.
Yeah. I mean, they didn't, obviously the shared responsibility model was something they didn't necessarily consider at that point, which is what we'll kind of get to. So I'm going to flip this a little bit into the CISO's perspective, where they're looking at this and going, right, the business is making all this change. No one's really asked me about this yet and said, what does this mean in terms of security? So often it can happen to security. This change happens, they've got to react to it. The easiest way to reduce risk in security is just to stop things, just to say, right, we're going to turn all this off, you're not having it. And that's the mentality that we had for quite a while in security. That just doesn't work anymore because businesses, AI is coming in, they're going to need to move with it. And this is the change in focus now in security. We all talk about enabling the business. I'm not sure in security that term's really been defined enough for people to fully understand it. But I think that is the concept around it now, is change is going to happen. It's how security going to move with it. Think back to the MVP days where you're creating an application or a product. The idea is just to get it out the door as fast as possible. They get to the MVP stage, then security look at it and go, oh, sorry, guys, you can't do it. That's created a cultural issue with security where they think, oh, they're just blockers, they don't help us do anything. That's where boards and particularly security leadership need to work together much more closely to understand that more.
I'll tell you the other thing, though, as well, is it's also about changing governance and supply chain security in particular. Because one of the ways in which, from a digital point of view, we take advantage of that digital ecosystem and all the software services in the cloud. We do API integration, we just consume services when we need them, but you've got to be able to make sure that the services you're consuming are at least not making your security posture worse. So it feels to me that the sort of cloud supply chain security topic that everyone was looking at over the last 10, 15 years when we were doing cloud migrations is just going to get even more important. And I still think there's a big gap in supplier governance, procurement and supply chain security keeping up with this pace of change.
Completely common thread.
Going back to the change of, a few years ago, your supplier management were, finger in there, how do they look sort of approach to supplier management. Now you sort of move forward where, okay, we do a good due diligence with our direct supplier. You know what I mean? And then you put it within their gift to look after their suppliers and their suppliers. More and more the problems have been coming down that chain.
Supply chain breaches have been a big source of some of the big security issues we've seen in the last few years.
One of the most common threads that we see now is attacks through supply chains. Even if you take Okta, for instance, which is a relatively recent one, that was a breach through a managed service provider. Some info stealer malware was put on, and there was some remote control access malware as well, which then enabled access into the Okta back end. That was all through supply chain. I mean, again, we speak to companies around interesting things like IoT now, and the supply chain risk that creates for them, both from the perspective of the IoT environment actually being compromised and used in attacks itself. We've had some really interesting conversations with clients around that.
Almost as a bot network or denial of service type things.
Botnet or even managed service providers been breached, and kind of, again, we're back to existential risk around what you're going to accept as a company, depending on what you do.
I think a lot of time we in the past, certainly, we've tried to tie things up in contracts. You know what I mean? But if you get hit
contracts can't keep up, can they?
No,
they're a point in time understanding.
Exactly, and if you get hit by a breach, actually a contract doesn't always, it might have some liability in some area that is detailed within the contract. But again, if you think about reputations and other sort of non-tangible elements of risk that you can't put a price on, that can't always be tied up in the contract. And as I said, you can't have a contract for your supplier's supplier. So to speak, and then there's also the complication of subscription services, for example, and how you generally don't have a contract. There'll be some terms and conditions that you'll sign to because you want to work at pace. You want to, get things moving. So you subscribe to something, you move on, and the due diligence then is sort of left out of that. If you're not on top of it, it's such a large area to keep on top of.
I think it's really difficult to know and be able to assess third parties effectively to provide appropriate level of assurance dependent on the criticality of the service they're providing. I think it's a really tricky one, and I think you can do all sorts of due diligence, and there'll be something that happens that is completely come out of the something that was unexpected as such. And I think some of that is just inherent risk from the use of third parties within critical business processes, if I'm honest.
So sometimes you've got someone you need to use because you might be doing a niche product or something like that, or fintech, or all these type of quick to market sort of industries, and they don't have any history as well. So there are tools you can use to sort of check on people's due diligence before you start and things like that. But that again, it's tough to sort of keep them up to date. Security scorecards.
Yeah, it all points back again. We mentioned kind of security governance and the kind of the culture you're going to set around security from that level. If you take like shadow IT, something that always crops up. This is another supply chain issue. This is the IT that people are using that you don't understand or you don't know about. AI has actually introduced a whole new aspect to this. But it actually increases productivity sometimes as well. So as a business, do you really want to say to everyone, no, these are the only tools you're ever allowed to use. This is exactly how you want to work, particularly if you're in creative industries. You may want them to be using disruptive technology at different times. You may want them to be looking at AI and see how that can enhance your business. So it's actually quite a difficult prospect from a security leader because you then, okay, what risk does this pose? What is this going to do? If data gets out, it's actually a really tricky one to be in. But if you get that culture right, which is back down to kind of the right governance, and actually security being part of the governance structure more than it is in a lot of industries, you can start to address that.
AI is a good one because it ties a lot of these subjects back together. Typically, most AI is going to be delivered through suppliers, through products often running in the cloud. You're going to have a massive impact on how you operate in the business and in a way that carries reputational risk, creates new ways of interacting with people. So it creates new threat vectors and new risks in your business. There's actually not huge amounts of technical work to do sometimes for some types of AI, but it has a massive impact on your IT estate potentially and on your data. And so the way in which you're protecting and managing your data and controlling access to it is fundamental to your success with AI. And you can only deal with this from a cyber point of view if you're incredibly well integrated at a business level and understand how the business is going to use the technology.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of looking at AI, and it's still very new. But I always think there is the threats from AI. So that is how a threat actor is using AI to accelerate and enhance their activities. We're all seeing phishing emails get a lot better. Almost undetectable now. They're that good. Deepfake. We've seen a lot of fraud, fraudulent payments made, pretending to be CEOs on calls and stuff. It's fascinating if you want to have a look at that. Then there's the threats to AI itself. So this is, if you take private equity again as a sector, they're using AI now to look at, can they make financial decisions based using AI to kind of enhance and accelerate that. If you can do things like indirect injection into those models, which is possible because, if you look at the prompt, then you look at the context that gets made from that, which is drawn from different data sources, and then there's kind of the output. If you can get things into that context, so this could be people trying to manipulate markets, they could be trying to get certain companies a higher value than they are. That's a huge risk kind of AI itself. And then there's the of AI bit, as in businesses not adopting AI, kind of to your point, James. Is that going to put them further down in the market because they're seen as being a bit backwards? It's a huge thing to navigate because it permeates so much wider than, say, blockchain, for instance. That was another recent one, but it had quite unique use cases. But AI is going to be absolutely everywhere. And to be honest, I don't really think we quite understand it enough in security yet to make kind of tangible decisions about it yet. There's still a discovery process to go through.
I think part of the problem with that is AI isn't one thing, and it looks very different in different scenarios.
Yeah.
So from a cyber point of view, you've got very, very different challenges depending on what AI actually means. But that's a topic in its own right. I think our colleagues have got some podcasts on that. Yeah. So let's make this real for what it feels like when you're inside one of our customers. We've talked about needing to deal with constant changing challenges. Yeah. That's difficult. You just need more people to do that effectively.
Yeah.
Now, we know in practice you can't just expect a blank check and hiring more and more people. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with that mismatch between an increased range of challenges but not enough people? What does that gap look like? Like how many people do you really need to deal with this huge array of challenges?
Yeah. I mean, this is something we see a lot within our client base. It's the usual argument that you need the skill sets of 15 people, but you can afford 2. And it's how do you increase your capacity without exponentially increasing cost alongside it. And it's one of probably the biggest kind of risks almost to what we're doing in cybersecurity is the fact that there is the hiring shortage. There's a skill set shortage as well, which is going on. So it's hard to find people. And we're finding clients as well that want more hands-on work now.
Have we got an example of where we've seen this happen in practice?
As a kind of a real example, client that we're working with at the minute, it's a large-scale construction project in a highly regulated industry, and at the minute they have 1 FTE equivalent that's doing security. Because of the regulatory factor, they need much more than that. They're also trying to build out their security capabilities and operations as they go, and one person trying to do that whilst also being thrown kind of third-party due diligence assessments they've got to do, risk assessments they've got to do. It's just kind of 20 things going into one, and it doesn't work. So what we're able to do is try and enhance that team as much as we can, but still working alongside the leadership element in that organisation.
I think in another direction, I've got another occasion where I've worked where you are working as a VCISO, but if there's any element that you're not sure about, or that you don't have the time and resource to do, you can dip back into your colleagues and your experience. So you've got your own experience in that particular area, but if someone's a bit more of a network expert and you want some, you can always drop back into that, and I think that really helps with those sort of occasions as well.
Yeah, I think there also can be that idea that you need to have a bit of elastic nature to your resourcing. So you need to bring in some particular skill sets where you don't need to have a permanent resource to do that going forward, but you need to bring some challenge in to maybe do a bit of design and architecture work as an example, but you don't need that on an ongoing basis. So being able to bring someone in to deliver that is a fast-paced delivery and also upskill existing resources works well for some organisations.
Sorry, I was just going to say, because often you'll be in a situation where a customer will say, well, you'll say to a customer, you'll give them advice and you say, right, well, we need to do A, B, C. We're starting to build the risk management framework and the risks are coming out. Oh, well, we need to, this is one of our top priorities as a risk. And they'll look at you and say, right, well, we've employed you as CISO, you do that. And it's like, well, no, that's not what I'm here for. But I do know someone who can. And you can, you've got those contacts and that network almost at hand to fall back on. So, and it's also good for, a quick catch up in a way that, right, I need this experience. I know what I'm talking about, but I want a bit more detail. So I'll go find someone within the team that can do that for me.
The sort of thought I had was almost at the other end of the spectrum. Is this also about not doing things in-house that are commoditized nowadays? I mean, like SOC. I mean, I don't know. Are there customers doing things in-house that actually they don't need to anymore? Yeah. And the emphasis is probably building that real core team in-house who've got the network, got the knowledge, they're flexible, they understand the business. Yeah. And then how you leverage both sort of commodity partners, managed service partners, vendors, consultancies, they're all kind of part of the solution, aren't they? And you've got to think about how to redirect your spend to where you get the most impact.
Looking at the value proposition of the team, isn't it? And saying, actually, we can provide much more value on these core activities and we'll outsource X.
And I guess that's all about getting the right operating model under the right strategy linked up into what's that business objective.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, the metaphor is if you buy a house and you want water to come out your tap, you don't go and build a reservoir. and a water treatment plant, you plug into the mains. It's the same metaphor. So there will be certain like commoditized operations within cyber that are better to be outsourced. It's much more efficient, and that's what they do for a living a lot of the time as well. So and they can also see the wider context, particularly SOC services. If they're servicing many different clients, they can start to see trends within industries, within sectors, even attacks as they're going on. They could potentially start to see attacks pivoting into different places. So that's much more enhanced. So it's much more efficient to outsource that. Elements of security architecture as well. If you're particularly going into new platforms, that can be really useful at that point as well, because to get the skill set in at that point can be really difficult. So again, it's all part of that strategy and the operating model that security leaders need to own and the board needs to kind of challenge and advise on.
And I guess figuring out what's core, what's commodity, and where you need the flexibility. And
I mean, so
building your partnerships to achieve all of that.
Yeah, I mean, certain sectors, and particularly the highly regulated ones, will need an element of internal capability. That'll be mandated to them anyway. But it's ring fencing that bit and then seeing what can we now outsource to make it more efficient.
Very good.
Yeah.
So Ben, you were talking about the importance of threat modelling and understanding at a board level. Is this a sort of really standard thing that's the same across organisations? How much does it vary? And does this mean that boards have to understand the sort of different technicalities of what can happen in cyber, like ransomware, all that sort of thing? Yeah,
absolutely. This is actually one of the ways that boards can start to upskill themselves, is by understanding threat modelling. Threat modelling traditionally has been in the kind of DevSecOps or kind of application development arena with things like Pasta and Stride LM. What we've started to do now is develop threat modelling much more around the business context. So coming back to existential risk, we'll ask companies what their existential risks are, what can they not afford to lose. And then from that, we'll start to look at things like their industry, what they actually do as a business, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's energy, whether it's private equity, those sorts of industries, and create bespoke threat models to that business, which is the unique element. A lot of the time, these things are quite generic. People will say, yes, your risk is ransomware. Well, newsflash, I think everybody knows that. So it's looking much more specific into which threat actors would target you and why. From that, we can then derive the techniques and tactics that they would use. And from that, you can then start to build out this much more tangible threat model, which says this is why an attacker would attack you, for what reasons. And that's usually based around things like extortion attacks, which is where ransomware comes in. Ransomware is one form of extortion. There are other ones like data leakage. There's double extortion. There's insider extortion. Different techniques that way.
I'm feeling scared by you already.
I know. And there's denial of service, which can be anything from botnets that you see making a server go offline, all the way through to what we see with nation state actors, where they're preparing battlefields in preparation for sometimes kinetic activity. Wiper attacks that we saw in kind of some of the conflicts in recent years. Then you get fraud, which is the obvious one. Financial sector is heavily impacted by that. And then the last one is the espionage element, which sometimes is James Bond, sometimes it's actually a little less low tech, and it's intellectual property theft.
So by understanding all that, then it means that instead of having to sort of throw money at a big risk like that, you can actually fine tune your responses to that risk.
So when you can understand techniques and tactics that threat actors are using, you can then start to build onto like what you're doing in architecture, Matt, where this is what they'd actually do. So does our tooling, does our governance model, does our processes and people, are they able to deal with that? Rather than just buying the vendor because everyone else has it, it's actually, does that vendor mitigate the threats that we're facing?
And I guess at that point, you're getting to the point where cybersecurity can be seen as a partner in driving faster innovation, not just a blocker saying no to change all the time.
I really think we've moved on from that blocker sort of persona that we've been given, and I'm hoping that certainly through conversations, certainly through working with different clients that we work through, for example, we get that message through, not just for us but for the whole industry, if you know what I mean. Because I think we are different. I think there's a couple of things. I think people in general are more savvy about data protection, how things work, and security in general. So we have to be more open to the fact that transparent about what we do, because they understand it nowadays, and that they've got more backing from places like ICO and stuff like that will back them up on data protection issues and things like that. And I'd reiterate, what both Ben and Matt have said there about my first thing would always be look at how you manage the risk. Make sure that you've got a vehicle to manage risk throughout what you're doing, because I'd have that as one of the number one important things, because then as the environment changes, the risks will change, but you'll manage them in the same way.
And part of that's the alignment piece as well then, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that sort of trust and cultural piece, both between the business and cybersecurity and digital delivery, but also with your partners and supply chain as well. If you're all aligned, you've got a common view of risk, and you know how you're going to work together, then you can operate in partnership to really move much quicker. Is that a fair way to summarise it?
Absolutely. The best practices within organisations when all, from operations through to HR, through to finance, are all engaged with your information security teams, your data protection teams, your risk management teams, your compliance teams. If everyone knows what's going on, then it works so much better for an organisation, because there's less duplication in things like risk management. There's more understanding of what other people's goals are against, like the organisational goals. The security goals can then fit on top of that. You know what I mean? They can again, what we talked about, enable the organisational goals by backing them up. Like back to the cloud thing. If you had a strategy of moving everything into the cloud, and your security team knows that, then they can work with you to get into that position.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Instead of, we've got a strategy to work into the cloud. You work into the cloud and the security team goes, we're in the cloud now. Right. Okay. Well, we best do something about that.
Yeah.
You then fit in controls on top of something that's already happened, and it goes back to security by design. Doesn't it? If you're designing that strong security with projects and with the organisation as you're going along, you'll start at the strongest place. You'll come down, you'll lose some security, but you'll be at the place where the organisation is comfortable. And I think that's important.
Yeah. And maybe, if you're a board level member or a CEO watching this, maybe think 3 questions. When the last time you made a key business decision, at what point did you talk to security about it? Whether that's your security leader or your security team. Think about that. Probably next question is, when was the last time you spoke to your security leader or anyone in security about your strategy? If you don't know the answer to that, you probably need a security strategy. And then probably the third one is actually, are you aware of your operating model? Do you know what people you've got, what they're doing, what their purpose is? And again, if you don't know that, it probably points to security leadership, maybe needing to articulate that better at that level. But also, maybe if you're watching this and you're a security architect or an engineer, when was the last time you spoke to your CISO about the direction you're going in? When was the last time a CISO asked you, have you got the capacity to do what we're asking you to do? If those questions aren't being asked, then it points to that cultural shift that we need to make.
Those are great takeaways. What do you think, Dave? Any last thoughts? Any key takeaways?
Just that it's a changing environment, and we have, as we've said, we have got changes that are coming up. Quantum's going to have a massive effect on how security works, how business works. It's going to be very challenging. So, I think the key takeaway is, understand how to manage change.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think things are going to go faster, not slower, aren't they? So being set up for flexibility and changing faster, more safely is key. What do you think, Matt? Any last thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in a similar vein, I think it's the building partnerships rather than siloed teams, as I think traditionally has been the case. So ensuring that everyone is on the same wavelength, same expectations and objectives to deliver the right thing for the business.
Oh, very good. Well, I've really enjoyed that. I think, as we look ahead the next 10 years, it feels like it's going to be the same trends, but just going faster. So how we can try and catch up with this shift that's already going on and set ourselves up for success. That's our big challenge in cybersecurity. Yeah, very good. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Great conversation.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed that, we've got plenty of other podcasts, so please do like and follow us to access more content. And if you're interested in following up with us on any of the things we've discussed, then we'd love to do so. Thank you.